Welcome back to Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. Every 2 weeks, our podcast discusses key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and explores the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. With a general election expected in the UK sometime in 2024, in today's episode we are going to focus on what the key policy priorities are for the defence of the United Kingdom and for Britain's defence industry as a whole. We will also delve deeper into the wants and needs of British defence and the UK defence industry given the current geopolitical context and ask whether the current level of defence spending is sufficient, what more Britain could be doing to support its domestic industries, and how can we effectively collaborate with allies to secure our advantage. I'm Victoria Starrick-Summerlin, co-founder and director of strategy at the Council on Geostrategy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sir Michael Fallon, Secretary of State for Defence from 2014 to 2017, and Samira Braund, Defence Director at ADS Group. So Sir Michael Fallon does not need an extensive introduction, but just a couple of facts. Sir Michael is a British politician who served as Secretary of State for Defence from 2014 to 2017, and he served as Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party from 2010 to 2012, Minister of State for Business and Enterprise from 2012 to 2014, Minister of State at the Department of Energy and Climate Change from 2013 to 2014, and Minister of State for Portsmouth in 2014. Sir Michael is also an advisory council member of the Council on Geostrategy. And we are also absolutely delighted to have with us Samira Braund today, and Samira is the Defence Director of the ADS Group, a member of the ADS Group executive team, and the Defence Growth Partnership Programme lead. Previously, Samira was the Chief Executive of UK Defence Solutions Centre, delivering on behalf of the Defence Growth Partnership to power export-led growth. So Sir Michael and Samira, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start with a broad question. What are the main issues facing British defence and the defence industry as of today? Sir Michael.
The main issues, I think, are the increased threats to our country, the scale and complexity of those threats compared to earlier threats. Second, whether we have the right capabilities to meet those threats. And third, whether either of the two main political parties have the right degree of spending commitment to enable us to put those capabilities in place over the next 5 years, over the next two parliaments, to meet those threats.
So what are these threats, Sir Michael, in your view?
These threats are now worldwide. These are threats in the Euro-Atlantic area from what Russia is doing on our own continent following the invasion of Ukraine and the pressure on other countries on the eastern side of NATO. Increased turbulence in the Middle East. We've seen attacks on British shipping. We're obviously affected by the continuing war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And further afield as well, we are affected by instability in the Indo-Pacific. Specifically, of course, the way China has undermined democracy in Hong Kong, the way it threatens Taiwan, but also the aggressive nature it's taken towards the South China Sea and the international navigation and shipping rights there. So these are a number of threats that are now combining to threaten both our economic security and our physical security as a country.
Samira, do you agree that the situation is more precarious than before?
The position that we're in at the moment is just unsustainable. And from an industry perspective, in the light of Ukraine, we have seen the stockpiles, the way that the government and industry have worked previously in a peacetime footing, that industry just doesn't hold these stockpiles, and now we're moving to more of a conflict-based footing. That supply chain resilience is absolutely key at this moment in time. And so, building on Sir Michael's point around an increase in defence spend, we need that from an industry perspective to look at how we can increase our manufacturing, to build up the demand that we need to support NATO and our wider allies. I mean, from other key areas from an industrial perspective, We have key challenges in defence around ESG investment, and we really are struggling to see some of that investment coming in, not into such the large primes, but also from an SME basis. So just access to finance is a key priority that we want the next government to really focus on. And then that's really underpinned by the skills base that we need to support the enduring capability. We know that there's a significant critical skills gap. We have, currently through our ADS Defence facts and figures, there's 147,000 people employed across defence, and most of that, 70%, is outside of London and the South East. But the challenges of recruitment, retention, and actually attraction, more importantly, is absolutely key. And with what's going on from a geopolitical perspective, we really need to focus on an attraction campaign to bring new individuals into the defence, to better understand the value of defence, to better understand the role that we play in peacetime, in expeditionary. So I absolutely support the comments that Sir Michael made.
So, Samira, you've given us an industry perspective on this issue. Do you feel that the same view is held in Whitehall and in Westminster or in wider society?
So from a societal perspective, we know from a recent poll that defence didn't even make the top 10 in public society, and actually it became lower than other. So there is a key campaign that we need to deliver to get wider societal views, better understanding the role that defence plays in national security and providing the freedoms for our nation and providing the democracy that we have and that we all love here. From a government perspective, it's the financial contribution to defence is the significant issue here, and the spending or lack of spending that we have, and really where we focus that spending on. Government are supportive of some of our concerns around ESG and investment, and we're actually making inroads in setting up a Treasury task force, which has now taken place. But we're right at the beginning of the journey, so there's still lots to do.
Sir Michael, not even in top 10 key priorities for our nation. How come?
I think that's been the case for a number of years now, since the end of the Cold War. And I think there was a perception, that liberal democracy was triumphing and everything was going to be peaceful thereafter. And that wasn't really diminished by the kind of expeditionary campaigns that were mounted in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think you see in the public reaction to the invasion of Ukraine and the way the British have got involved, for example, in hosting Ukrainian refugees, in raising money for Ukraine, and the recent attack in Salisbury, I think you see the public more and more worried about Putin. And I think that is now slowly going to transfer to the political process. And I hope that people will demand of the political parties a much stronger priority. Now, it's always been true in the last 10 or 20 years, both parties, I think, have implied it, that there aren't really any votes in defence, or they tend to be very concentrated in defence-type places like Portsmouth or Barrow, for example. I'm not sure that is so true now, and I notice both parties are, very keen, to endorse the military, to support the various campaigns that are running at the moment, and to be pictured always with the Union Jack and making particular pledges to veterans and so on. So I think the public perception, public may be ahead of the politicians here, but I think the politicians are beginning to notice.
So we are in the election year, and the key question, I guess, is what should the next government, whoever they may be, do to address these issues? Samira.
So we need to focus on increase in GDP funding from 2%. We've heard that whatever government they're focusing on to ramp that up to 2.5%, and really we need to push that further out, maybe to 3%. in order to do that, the benefits that will provide is giving industry an on-demand signal. So at the moment, the way that our manufacturing production is feast and famine. And actually what we really need to do is to develop an enduring capability around some of our sovereign areas. And so with focusing on the increase in funding will then provide us with the capability to support the manufacturing base more broadly. Sir Michael mentioned earlier the role that we play with our allies, the Indo-Pacific. And so we have a number of key campaigns that need to be continually supportive. And you've heard the announcement of AUKUS, and we've got GCAP. But we also need to strengthen our relationships with NATO and the EU and really exploit the role that we play and be a thought leader. And actually, I'm starting to now see some of the changes in those behaviours of government and military personnel really stepping forward to really move the dialogue forward.
So, Michael, you were a very senior member of the government for many years. There are many expectations that the industry has, and of course, this year there will be political manifestos that will be prepared and some policy commitments that will be made. Could you please explain to us how these manifestos and policy commitments are made? What are the main considerations? How does the process look like?
Well, the main considerations are the priorities that the party would attach to any particular issue, whether it's housing, the health service, or indeed defence. And what has to go in the manifesto is some commitment on spending, as to what the level of spending should be, and secondly, any legislative changes that are needed. Now, we're not looking, I think, for too many legislative changes in defence, but we're certainly looking for increased spending, because if the threats are now more serious than they were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, if they're worldwide, if they're there in Euro-Atlantic and the Middle East and Indo-Pacific, then obviously you need to boost your defence budget to cover it. Now, it's quite easy to mock a particular percentage target. It's bound to be arbitrary. But unless you have that kind of target, and that's what NATO agreed on 10 years ago, unless you have a target, then it's quite easy for other ministers, the cabinet as a whole, or the Treasury to kind of brush defence aside. And that's why I think one of the most important things is to see what the wording is around that particular spending target for each of the big political parties. And then secondly, as Samira said, I'd like to see some commitment to some of the long-term programmes, because otherwise industry is stopping and starting again. And that's why it's so important that when you have a long-term programme like the AUKUS submarine programme involving Australia and the United States, or the GCAP fighter programme involving Italy and Japan, then you really do need to give that longer-term commitment that goes through, it's not only bipartisan, but goes through the next Parliament and into the Parliament beyond. And finally, I would hope we would be learning from recent events and look to see where our capabilities really need to be improved. And that is in air defence. Well, we've seen the vulnerability, for example, of a country like Ukraine to attacks from the air. And finally, in new technologies, where clearly the other countries are pushing ahead with the application of new technology, new instruments of war, and indeed instruments of war in new domains like cyber and space.
We have recently been working with you, Sir Michael, on our defence investment campaign, and recently published the Defence Pledge, urging all political parties to commit to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP with a longer-term commitment to 3%. Well, the numbers that we've already discussed with both of you. Samira, the question is, what should we be spending more on if we increase our defence spending? What are the key priorities?
So the key priorities for the immediate term is integrated air missile defence, as Sir Michael highlighted. We, from an exportability perspective, Our industry have a very strong capability, but from a homeland perspective, it's not something that I feel that the UK government have necessarily invested in adequately. And so we have time to ensure that we protect ourselves if any conflict was to happen. The other key area that we really need to focus on is PNT, precision, navigation and timing, from a GEO-LEO perspective, and the multi-domain integration from sensory to look at how we are interoperable with both other capability areas, but more importantly with our allies as well. So they're two key areas that we really do need to focus additional spend in. And then we have new technologies, so artificial intelligence, and actually how do we pull some of the capability from other sectors into defence. So there are some very strong AI capabilities, but we're really not very good at sometimes adopting technical capability rather than hard-edged warfare capability. And so there's a number of transformation programs underway at the moment, but the focus needs to be how we speed up our procurement to really deliver capability in the arms of the warfighter earlier.
So, Michael, would you agree?
Yes, I'd agree with all of that. I think my own particular list would be a bigger navy. We've got to be in all oceans of the world at the moment. The submarine program is very important, but we do need a larger navy. Secondly, we do need to start investing now in the next generation of fighters. I mentioned the GCAP program, but let's reflect on the fact the RAF have been involved almost continually now for the last 10 years. They've been fighting Daesh in Iraq and Syria. They've been fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea, and just recently they've been helping defend against Iranian missiles. So we do need to think ahead to the next generation aircraft that the RAF will need. And then I think, as Samira has hinted, we need a more specialised army that can cope with some of these new technologies. That might be a slightly larger army, but it's certainly got to get into the new technologies and be able to fight back against offensive cyber.
So, Michael, you referred to NATO a couple of minutes ago, and you were Defence Secretary during the 2014 NATO summit in Wales, which saw the introduction of the 2% spending commitment for all NATO members. Now, why was it introduced? Was achieving this easy? And are you happy with where we currently stand?
Well, it was introduced in the aftermath of the invasion of Crimea, which had taken place earlier that year with the insurrection in the Donbass as well. And a very strong feeling amongst the Allies that we had let our guard down against Russia in particular. Russia had, although welcomed into the international community, to the G8 and so on, Russia had invaded Georgia and had now invaded Crimea, and there was a realization that we needed really to do more. This, by the way, did not come from President Trump. This came from President Obama, and has in fact been argued for by successive American presidents. So we decided to set this new target. A number of the allies made it clear they were way off 2%. Even today, half the alliance doesn't spend 1.5%. So we gave them 10 years to reach the 2% target, which I think was a pretty generous timetable. And that 10th year is now. It's this year. So I would like to see NATO leaders, when they meet at the Washington summit in a few weeks' time, I'd like to see them revisit this target, set a new target, a higher target, to keep pushing spending up, because other countries are obviously doing more. The Russians clearly are spending more. America has always spent more than Europe. But if you look now at the NATO map, most of the countries that have met the 2% target are actually on the eastern frontier of NATO. They're even east of Berlin. And they're not the wealthiest countries. They're the Baltic states. They're countries like Romania, for example. So we really need a tougher target and a sharper timeline to ensure that the rest of Europe, particularly the western side of the alliance, does meet its obligation.
So currently we have 11 countries that spend 2% or more. How do we encourage the rest to achieve at least 2% before we encourage them to achieve more?
Well, they're committed to 2%. That was the commitment they made at the Wales Summit 10 years ago. A number of them have assured the Secretary-General that they are on track. A rather dubious phrase, to be on track. It doesn't mean you've met the target. It means you're planning or hoping to meet the target in a few years' time. But, we really have to remind those countries that it is the taxpayers of the others, the taxpayers of Romania, are doing more for European security than the taxpayers of Italy or France. And that is not, is not politically or morally sustainable.
Samira, let's get back to the UK. And I would be very interested to learn a bit more about the recent manifesto that ADS published earlier this year in January, I believe, calling upon all political parties to commit to a renewed industrial strategy to secure domestic advantage. Now, why is this domestic advantage important, and how does ADS propose Britain achieves it?
So the manifesto actually breaks down into key areas. So we have our domestic advantage, global advantage, and future advantage. And so across our sectors, not only defence, if we develop a comprehensive industrial strategy, it will provide an attractive investment environment for the UK. And I think that's the key thing is how do we get greater investment into the UK? Importantly, the manifesto talks about how do we address the workforce shortages in partnership with industry. And I feel that since skills was moved out of what was BIS into Department of Education, industrial skills have been lost. And so how do we reinvigorate that? Because we have a number of international programs as well as delivering our own domestic capability, and we won't be able to do that without having a campaign to bring skills up into the forefront, and that's across many sectors, not just defence. It's really important that we strengthen our UK supply chains and build that resilience and competitiveness, and through some of these international programs, especially AUKUS, and with the changes in legislation where we're having the ability to have mobility of the workforce across all three nations, is actually an area that we can leverage and exploit, especially as we're helping the Australians to develop their Indigenous capability. The UK's strength is in training, and so there's a real opportunity to bring Australians across to the UK to help plug our gap, help deliver our capability, but more importantly, help them develop their own Indigenous capability. And then we need to bring forward a wider trade and export strategy, and that needs again to be co-created with industry, because it's industry that delivers that hard edge capability in partnership with government. And we're seeing a lot of movement in that space with MOD developing their own G2G framework and setting up defence partnership offices. And so we're now moving towards how do we implement that hand in glove with industry. And that needs to be bolstered by a stronger export promotion and licensing functions. So we need to look at how we can strengthen that. And then finishing off with how do we ensure the UK regulatory area has the right resources, and there is some work that needs to be done across the regulation, and I feel some of the new integrated procurement model absolutely helps address these areas by building in exportability at the front end as we look at how we define future capability areas. How do we spiral technology? How do we have minimum viable capability that's at 60% that we could scale up to 80% and not develop exquisite capability that is not affordable? So there's a number of key areas, but happy to go into more depth.
So let's try to put this in a wider national context. So how far-reaching are the benefits of those proposals that you have in that manifesto?
So from an exportability perspective, we know that 38% of industry's resources supports international exports, which is a significant amount. And so with these policies being implemented, it generates greater productivity, it generates greater employment, both direct and indirect. It helps secure our nation and allow it to prosper. So by having the right investment and creating the right environment, it allows us to access the finance, it allows our workforce to develop in those key areas that we really do need to focus on.
So Michael, when I listen to Samira, there are many benefits that could benefit our country, but are we doing a good job in explaining this to the wider society?
Well, not yet, I think, is the answer to that. And there have always been some reservations in Britain about industrial strategy, because we've had examples, long before you were born. We've had examples of governments trying to pick winners and investing in motor car companies and whatever, and companies that weren't always the best suited to their particular market. So there's always been a reservation about industrial strategy, and I think that is largely now redundant. Clearly, as Samira says, we need to strengthen our supply chains, and the pandemic showed us that, but also the need to have the right inventories is also relevant. And secondly, we need to protect our national security and make sure we're not losing key technologies inadvertently when bits of companies are sold off to Chinese companies, for example. And thirdly, we do need some focus on some of these new technologies that we've discussed about. And I think overall the answer is to not speak so much in terms of industrial strategy, but to speak of defence as a national enterprise that really should be involving industry and government, should be involving society and education more widely, that this is a national enterprise, that all of us need to be thinking about how we defend our country better and what it's going to take to invest in that defence for the future.
So Mira, would you agree?
I wholeheartedly agree, and I just want to pick up on the point around further exploring some of the supply chain resilience, and you would have seen in the Defence Command paper refresh, they introduced the term onshoring and friendshoring, and we really do need to build our resilience in those areas, and working with our allies. It might also help us address some of our critical minerals, areas that we have gaps in, and actually how we have enduring supply chain across some of our key capabilities, because we know that in certain capability areas that there's a bottleneck at the bottom where only maybe one or two suppliers in the UK, and actually if we're going to build that resilience in, then friendshoring is definitely an area that we need to focus on.
So the UK is a key part of international alliances and partnerships such as NATO and AUKUS. And it is not just the UK that will be facing a general election this year. According to The Economist, more than half the people of this planet will hold nationwide elections in 2024 or have already held. In such a significant year, how can Britain ensure continuity in working effectively with its allies and partners? Sir Michael.
Well, we're already working with allies. It's very unlikely that Britain actually is going to go to war again entirely on its own. The Falklands perhaps was the last example, and that was 40 years ago. We're already working closely with allies, with the United States and some of the European allies in the Middle East. We're working to defend our sea lanes around the world, and we are now into these longer-term capability partnerships on the submarines and on the next generation of fighter aircraft, which in the end are far more important. I think we used to think of allies in terms of showing the flag, rather transient deployments. I recall sending the RAF Typhoons for the first time through the South China Sea, or we send a destroyer or an aircraft carrier on a one-off mission in a different ocean. It is the longer-term capability partnerships, I think, that are the key to securing these alliances, where we're able to share operability, we're able to exercise and train together, and indeed to improve each other's skill base. I think they are very largely, very, very important for the future. And then secondly, so far as NATO is concerned, we should be leading in NATO. I'd like to see the government really step up to that leadership role, whoever the new American president is, and help to cajole the rest of NATO into meeting these targets and modernizing the NATO militarily. And finally, we have to, I'm afraid, come back to the subject of the European Union, which has its own defence programmes, it has its own defence research, its defence agency and so on. And I think we've got to find more ways in Britain of getting closer to some of those programmes, which aren't always inclusive. There are other, what I call third countries involved in them. And, they're there, and I think we have to recognise that and get closer.
We'll get back to that EU question and NATO collaboration question in a moment. But Samira, international collaboration often presents some challenges, and we have competing national interests, and we have a number of countries that we need to deal with from the industry perspective. How can these challenges be overcome?
So something that we've been working with our Defence Growth Partnership colleagues as well as government is implementing a public-private partnership agreement, so bringing government together, industry together, and trade association together to better understand, the challenges, how we can help remove the barriers, and actually bringing the communities together to deliver a greater effect. We have to prioritise the relationships that we have with our allies and our strategic partners, and you've seen some recent successes, the ones that we've spoken today, but also Poland. If you look at what we've delivered in Poland as an enterprise, it's been a huge success. And we're developing another enduring relationship, and similarly out towards Norway as well with the new Future Frigate programme. So I think that there's a couple of areas around prioritisation, around where we as a nation need to focus that will secure greater effect, continuing to maintain the strategic relationships that we have with other nations, and absolutely delivering against the programmes of AUKUS and GCAP.
So the EU and the UK will be reviewing their trade and cooperation agreement. And the key question is, should Britain be looking to enter into agreements with the EU that enable and support greater levels of foreign and defence policy cooperation? Sir Michael?
Yes, when that review starts next year, you're obviously starting from very different positions. Brussels sees it as a review of the existing agreement, whether it's working okay, whether it just needs to be tweaked here and there. I think from the British point of view, it's a very good opportunity, actually, not just to see how the agreement is actually working, particularly in Northern Ireland, but also to look at areas that were simply left out of the original exit arrangements. Financial services is one, but security and defence cooperation is another, where it was originally envisaged there might indeed be a separate treaty that would bring us closer to the existing cooperation machinery of the European Union, and which I think we've lacked. So I would hope that whoever is in government next year will seek a closer relationship. I think that's inevitable now, given the amount of funding that's going into some of these EU programmes, and the fact that we need to do more to collaborate, not least to get more common standards across the European Union, and make sure that it's in everybody's interest to have those kind of processes that enable industry to develop longer supply lines and to respond to the various demand signals better.
Samira, is this needed in your view?
100%. The recent publication of the European Defence Industrial Strategy shows the growing need for EU and UK cooperation, given the increasing EU ambitions to create a better industrial policy and to grow the European defence and technology industrial base. Reinforcing the defence industrial base must now be seen as a strategic imperative by UK and NATO. And the UK is working alongside its allies to increase defence production and to pick up on the interoperability and secure supply chains. NATO's Defence Production Action Plan is an essential framework for reinforcing that base, industry fully support this. But progress has been made, and maybe not to the level that we would like. But by the UK, we've set up the joint procurement initiatives to make progress around standardisation and interoperability. And so Project Diamond, the latest version around integrated air missile defence, is something that they will be raising at the Washington Summit. We've already had a number of nations that are keen to join that project.
The EU and NATO are identified in the 2024 ADS manifesto as two organisations the UK should strengthen ties with. Sir Michael, we know that with the new NATO Secretary General to be appointed later this year, along with the new European Commissioner, and if the current polls are correct, possibly a new British Prime Minister as well, how can the UK navigate these changes and ensure that these relations continue to be successful and effective?
Well, this isn't a new issue or a new problem. I mean, we've been aware for some time there's always that potential. There are some countries that belong to the European Union that probably won't join NATO at any particular point. And indeed, there are some NATO countries that won't join the European Union. So we've been aware of the need for the two to work more closely together. And at the Warsaw Summit back in 2016, we agreed, a number of areas in which there could be closer cooperation between the two bodies, and that's now really what's got to happen. So there isn't any overlap, and there isn't waste, and that we find more effective ways of standardising some of our procurement. And I think the lessons here are from Ukraine, where although NATO has a procurement agency, it wasn't really able to mobilise it because some countries weren't prepared to commit as thoroughly to Ukrainian defence as we were, or as the Poles were, for example. So chose to act on a kind of minilateral basis in particular groupings. So we've really got to learn from that and make sure there isn't duplication and overlap between what the European Union is doing and what NATO it wants to do. And I think that's perfectly avoidable, but it it means that Britain is very well placed, I think, to take a lead in that, having been a prominent member of both, now only in NATO, but also one of the biggest defence spenders in Europe and one of the largest defence industries in Europe.
Sir Michael and Samira, thank you so much for joining me to discuss these timely issues and sharing your insights. And thank you for listening to Defence Talk Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems. If you would like to submit a question for our next episode, please email them to defencetalks@geostrategy.org.uk. You can also find our upcoming podcast episodes on our website, and please visit www.geostrategy.org.uk/defencetalks. Until next time.